Hello, this is Dr. David Kanan with the lecture Challenges to Public K through 12 Education in the United States. And this is for PA 460 Administration and Public Policy Development, Module 6. So education as a right. While that is often thought of the case now, that's not always been the situation in the United States. It wasn't not a fundamental right under the Constitution until the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was interpreted to state that when a state establishes a public school system, no child living in that state may be denied access to schooling. And this would be equal access to schooling. They felt that segregation, even if equal, wasn't allowable under the 14th Amendment. And that's Brown v. Board of Education, 1954 Supreme Court ruling, which set the precedent. Public education equals positive externalities. It's good for society. Educated people help the common good. Educated people produce upwardly mobile citizens who pay taxes and more taxes, better workforce, more competitively at the state level, as well as nationally and globally, and less need for public support programs. So if one is more upwardly mobile and able to pay more taxes and has a decent job, generally they have benefits provided by the employer, and so there's less need for public support programs. It also, especially initially, was thought very valuable in the assimilation of a diverse group of immigrants. If you can think of the turn of the 19th to 20th century, you had millions and millions of significant portion of the population at the time from a vast array of different nations in Europe, all speaking different languages with different cultures. And this was considered to be very positive step towards assimilation into what they hoped would be a melting pot. Finally, the perpetuation of our democracy. You want informed voters who can understand the issues. Sometimes that has been better than others. Unfortunately, nowadays, I think that we have some other issues that are perhaps biasing people in one direction or the other based on where their information comes from. So public education would be there to make sure that people can understand what's valid and what is not. So government role in public K through 12. Public education in the United States, and initially you were looking at public education for elementary school and perhaps for junior high school. And then eventually high school became more common. Initially, high school was more for students who wanted to go on to college. And this changed in the 20th century to expand high school for everyone. But this is a more recent phenomenon in the last 100 years or so. And the financing for schools was controlled by state and local governments, particularly local governments, and with minor financial support from the federal government that came in 1965 with Title I funding, and very little federal control in general until No Child Left Behind later on. Historically, the financing was the local level, local property taxes, and this was problematic in that it perpetuated inequity for generations in this country. So for example, if one grows up in a wealthy neighborhood, they will have a tax base that's going to provide for a very well-funded school system. So their schools will more likely be a lot more effective. Whereas if one grows up in a poor neighborhood, the funding of the schools based on local property taxes will be far less per student, and you will more likely have a poorer, less effective education situation. And this went on for many generations. And oftentimes when we talk about that divide and inequity based on socioeconomic status, you can see direct correlations based on race, ethnicity, etc. Segregation in the South was systematic and therefore separated students based on race into two separate school systems for generations. And in outside of the South and the North and the West, one felt that segregation wasn't occurring, but it did occur through suburbanization or through redlining. And that also created division among race, ethnicity, and class, which continues till today. Federal role really kept their hands out of public education until the 1960s, at least at the K through 12 level. They did have a lot of programs put forth for a long time for higher education, but not as much for public K through 12. So this changes 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which creates a Title I funding for schools based on low income. And basically that amount of funding till today isn't going to provide for much more than about 10% of the school budgets. So while it is great and it was set up to help schools from traditionally lower income areas that wouldn't have the funding based on the property taxes to provide the same type of education in wealthier districts, the 10% probably wasn't getting them anywhere near the level of equity with the wealthier school districts. No Child Left Behind in 2002, we're going to talk about, and that was new federal accountability. So that was created, the impetus was, accountability for teachers and schools and school districts. And then later on, Every Student Succeeds Act was a revision of No Child Left Behind, which had subtle changes to No Child Left Behind. And we'll talk about that in a second. So how K through 12 education is funded currently, local funding, primarily property tax, still accounts for quite a bit of the funding. This is nationally. Now, every state is going to be different, and there's even differences among school districts within states. So overall, about 40% of school funding comes from property taxes. And again, you still see the poor districts are poorly funded, and this has been going on for generations. State funding, income and sales taxes contribute to about half of school funding. And again, every state is different. And sometimes the state funding mechanism, such as that in Florida, will be using local taxes, property taxes, and sales taxes at the state level, combining them and creating a per student funding mechanism. That's what the state of Florida has had actually since the 1970s, which was very progressive, believe it or not, for the time, and decades ahead of many other states. My home state of Michigan didn't switch to a more equitable per student funding model until the 1990s. Federal funding, again, is less than the state or local funding for schools. Despite all the rhetoric during federal elections for president or Senate, there's a lot of talk about education. Really, for K through 12, until No Child Left Behind, there wasn't a lot of emphasis at the federal level for making much change. You have other programs at the federal level which have been successful. The National School Lunch Program through the USDA is very, very popular and serves millions and millions of students. About 30 million students each school day get the free lunch. So many schools receive it. As far as Title I funding, the majority of schools receive Title I funding, as you'll see in the module. The thought is to promote education funding as you pay now or you pay later. So you can pay now for education, or through a lack of education, there's going to be higher associations with poverty and crime, as well as ignorance, which leads to bad decisions and more poverty and more crime. So teacher pay less than average, not a shocker. The average weekly wages of public school teachers compared with college graduates, here you're looking at 1979 to 2017. And this is all in 2017 dollars. So you can see there has been improvements for college graduates and teachers from the 1970s. Well, from actually, it went down a little bit at around 79, but let's say the 1980s until you see around the 1990s a stagnation for teachers, for public school teachers, and it really hasn't risen above that level since, whereupon college graduates has risen and then stagnated later in the 2000s, where there hasn't been any increases. Actually, it's slightly less than it was in around 2000. And there's several reasons for this. The stagnation post 2002 with No Child Left Behind could be associated with the recession in 2001 after 9/11, the recession in 2008. It could also be associated with schools being responsible for additional testing resources and therefore moving resources from teacher pay to other areas. You could also have the proliferation of charter schools, and charter schools generally hire new teachers who are coming out of college because they're paid, exponentially less than established teachers. So a lot of factors could explain that. So California dreaming. How does California finance K through 12 education? They're a little bit late to the game, and the local control funding formula, which is an attempt at some sort of state level per student criteria for funding schools, accounts for about 57% of the school funding. And there is still, with the local control funding formula, we won't get into that too much, there's still some latitude for local districts to make decisions, have some sort of autonomy in making decisions on spending. So with 57% coming from the formula, local funding itself still accounts for 31% of the funding, and other state and federal are about 12%. And we will see California, unfortunately, is in the bottom quintile in the United States in per student funding. So that means we are in the bottom 20% of the United States per student funding. And this isn't having anything to do with cost of living adjustments. That's not calculated in this metric. So that's a bit alarming that California is that low. Other equity issues in California, you have historical disparity between rich and poor districts. We still see that to today. And this manifests through many, many, many divided areas with multiple school districts within a county, sometimes multiple school districts within a city. And this protects wealthy enclaves or wealthier enclaves from less wealthy enclaves. It's kind of an us versus them dichotomy. When you look at California compared to, let's say, Florida, you have close to 1,200 school districts, which is an astronomical number. Yes, California is much larger, but let's look at per people living in each district. What does that come out to in California, even though it is larger than Florida, about twice the size? So 30,455 people per district in California, which is very, very small for a school district on average in a very large urban state. And in Florida, you're looking at 74 districts, which correspond mostly with the number of counties. You do have some special districts. And that is almost 300,000 people per district. So almost a tenfold difference per district. And you ask, well, what difference does that make? Well, if you have larger groups of people, 300,000, that one district is accountable for, you're going to see more of a tendency toward equity because they have to work and deal with schools from multiple different types of socioeconomic backgrounds. Whereas with 33,000, you're going to have less differentiation, less diversity within the districts. They're going to be one way or the other most generally. And that will lead to differences in performance and differences in equity between the districts. So when adjusting for cost of living, public school teachers in California are among the lowest paid, and that's in the handful of lowest paid of all of the states in the union, which is also disturbing. And about 40% of high school graduates are eligible for CSU, and 14% are eligible for UC, and all students are eligible for the community colleges. So about half are going to the four-year state colleges, which in California are very split along the lines of the UC, University of California's, which are research-based, and the CSUs, which in the past were less research-based, though San Diego State is actually a very high research university, but that's unusual for most of the CSU or Cal State universities. So happening in really since the 1970s and 80s and onward, there was this movement for accountability in public schools. There was the image of the schools in the United States being broken, a disaster, and there needed to be accountability for teachers and for school administrators. And the blame was not falling on the parents or students, it was falling on the teachers and the administrators, and it had to be their fault that things are going so awfully. In reality, things weren't going as awfully as were portrayed. And sometimes one has to think that there was motivations behind this. There's always been motivations for school vouchers and school choice issues where the public funding, which is very large in states for schooling, can be used for private schools or alternative schools, etc. So while there was some real problems, there were bad teachers and there were bad outcomes, and there was terrible inequity between districts. The blame really didn't rest completely on the teachers' shoulders. It's obviously a lot more complicated. We're going to look at a study I put together later that will get into that a bit. So No Child Left Behind was meant as an accountability mechanism for states and public schools and school districts. And it emphasized statewide proficiency testing. So what came out of this, and most of you experienced this, was the one-size-fits-all standardized testing model. And so standardized testing for multiple subjects, so primarily math, science, and reading are English related, because it's very difficult to test some of the more creative or more conceptual subjects. And you had mechanisms put into No Child Left Behind that were mandated on the state that would punish schools and districts that didn't show what was called adequate yearly progress. And this was a universal standard saying that we want to see a 1% improvement in academic outcomes, in non-academic outcomes such as graduation rates and AP tests completed, etc. And if they didn't, that they would be punished. And states had to create a grading mechanism, and you've probably seen this. This is a grade A school, this is a grade B, a C. And there were issues with that because if you're a grade C school and that is the high school for the community, for that neighborhood, and maybe it's a poor neighborhood that's already struggling, that had detrimental effects on families wanting to move in there and bring their children to those schools. Therefore, property values decreased, people left, the schools lost funding because they're now on a per student basis for the most part in most states. And you also had your better students in average. Those people who left were from more affluent or from families whose parents prioritize education higher than the others. This is empirically supported by reams of research that those students will be more likely to be higher achieving. And with them leaving and the tax base leaving, it's sent this perpetual cycle of failure. The worst designation that could be given as a failing school designation. And this really perpetuated at-risk community issues, promoted just an exodus from the community, people leaving, especially those with resources and with higher achieving students. And then it was almost the end of that school. Very few schools survived the failing school designation. If schools were receiving consistent poor grades, they had to have some sort of compulsory reorganization, which included firing of administration, firing of teachers and faculty. And this created a lot of job insecurity. And being in Michigan when this first came to be throughout the early 2000s, we saw a lot of schools experiencing this. And basically, once this process started and you had the failing school and people started moving out and panicking and taking their kids out, and the ones who are left are the students whose families maybe were working, they couldn't afford to move the students to another area, just got a real terrible education experience, and then teachers would be fired, administrators would be fired, and then the school would close. And then you'd have other options that would pop up, charter schools, but there's accountability issues there, which we'll talk about in a second. Oftentimes you saw massive racial, economic, disability related and gender gaps that weren't addressed. They actually were exacerbated by the No Child Left Behind Act. In reality, the one size fits all model, especially with standardized testing, just doesn't make sense, especially with such punitive actions built into the system. So schools and communities suffered. There were few winners, many losers. In 2012, this is 10 years after No Child Left Behind was implemented, 8 in 10 schools were failing to meet the No Child Left Behind adequate yearly progress mark. So it became very difficult. And when this started happening, much of the discussion went that something has to be done to either revise or remove No Child Left Behind. So there's market-based public education reforms, which No Child Left Behind was based theoretically on market-based principle, that if there's competition among schools, if they're graded, then they will perform better because they will have to. Otherwise, they could lose their job and all of these terrible penalties. The reality is parents don't have an equal opportunity to take their kids in and out of different schools or move to different districts. That's just not the reality for the vast majority of people. And so the concept was fatally flawed from the moment it was implemented for that reason. One of the market-based reforms that's been perpetuated since then to this day are charter schools. And a charter school is a public school in that it's a for-profit or nonprofit entity that creates and operates the school. And sometimes it's part of the district. You'll have districts creating their own charter schools. And these charter schools have a lot of autonomy in how they run their school and do not have the same level of accountability mechanisms as your regular public schools. Or sometimes they're licensed with the state through a charter with the state to operate a school. But all the time they're using public funding. So these are public schools in that they're using public funding. Lots of problems came about. Are all charter schools terrible? No. Are they all great? Absolutely not. So you have some charter schools that were very good. I'm thinking of community school models in New York City. And then you have some that were awful and were started by companies or individuals from the private sector who had maybe great intentions, but didn't have the experience to operate a school, and they went under very quickly. And you had also some nefarious players who would open charter schools with a profit motive, and a lot of failures at that end too. Looking at empirical evidence, the first 10 years or so with the proliferation of charter schools, you didn't see results that were any better than regular public schools. It was about the same, in some cases worse. And you had 200 charter schools closing each year during the height of the charter school push. Probably some of you know of some charter schools that were started and closed down. Where I'm living now in Imperial Valley, there's a couple that were closed just recently. So this happens. In some ways, you can open the door for more innovation, but in a lot of ways, if you're removing that experience and wisdom from the district that already exists and replacing it with hope and aspiration, but not that wisdom or experience, you may have run into trouble. Another market-based public education reform is school choice. This is very popular with parents. However, it can be also problematic because with school choice, you're going to have parents choosing where their children can attend, and that's great. However, more often, the good schools are going to be where all the students want to go. So the good schools have to create some sort of mechanism, even though generally in most policies they're supposed to be lottery based. They will have some criteria, no amount of absences, etc., no criminal record, some sort of basic threshold of performance on the standardized testing. Those things do weed out a lot of students. So what happens is students will go to these schools, usually the higher achieving. You also have schools in Florida, they had the school choice program put forth where a lot of schools had criteria based on athletics. And so you have these powerful public kind of sports factories that were coming out. The parents wanted them to go to these good schools, so they get into these schools. And you have the same issue. Your at-risk schools, your less desirable schools in less desirable areas are not getting a rush of people wanting to come in. They're getting a vacuum of people wanting to leave. And so they start to struggle with less funding, less higher achieving students, more accountability issues, more penalties, and eventually close. You also have the issue with charter schools is that they are not required in most states to have union membership. And they generally will hire teachers who are graduating college or in their first few years. And they do this because it costs about half to hire someone just graduating college as it would to hire someone with 10, 15, 20 years of experience. So they have that advantage in hiring a lot of young teachers in that they're the most expensive part of running a school is the salaries, that their salaries are quite a bit less because of their new hires. However, obviously that's not sustainable long-term. So there are issues there. School vouchers is the most extreme of school choice measure, and that's basically taking the money, per student money that would be used at a public school, giving it to the families to choose to go to whatever school they would like, including private schools. And this, again, is going to cause the same types of issues with charter schools, kind of shedding the cream off the top of these, the struggling schools and leaving them with more concentrated poverty issues. And it also has the issue of the separation of church and state, and that's been a primary concern in the fight against school vouchers in most states. Let me go back just for a second. What I want to reiterate is charter schools sometimes are great. A lot of times they're problematic by design. School choice can be really great for an individual student, as can school vouchers. But when we're talking in aggregate at the community level, there's problems. It's problematic at the community level, even though it could be very beneficial at the individual level. And that's for society to decide where should we focus, to serve one individual or to serve the community. And oftentimes community is put above the individual, but as we've seen with this pandemic, that's not always the case. In this country, it's very individualistic, and there's a lot of desire for individual freedoms over community sustainability and benefit. So 2015, No Child Left Behind had caused, there were a lot of problems with it, and you didn't see that big of an increase in student achievement. Actually, in many cases, it was worse. So it didn't work, essentially, for the most part. So you have the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, and that returned much of the power to the states instead of having this federal control and impetus and punitive mechanism. So now the states could have autonomy again, and local school districts could have autonomy to address failing schools. They can set their own performance goals and school rating systems, and eliminated federal consequences for schools that perform poorly, because part of No Child Left Behind also was they could lose Title I funding. And it promoted parent input, which was not a requirement under No Child Left Behind, and forbid a national performance standard, such as Common Core, which we don't, it's in the text, we talk about it very little in this module, but Common Core is a very standardized testing base for especially math and science related subjects to have some sort of universal goal for education. And that actually came out of the states. It was state governors who proposed Common Core, not the federal government. But this law explicitly forbids that and any other performance standard to be enforced by the federal government. And that is probably moving in the right direction, but most states had established punitive systems already, and their new systems weren't very much different from the old ones. Some states more than other states. Less punitive, more likely than they were, but most states were still prioritizing standardized testing. So there's still a lot of elements from No Child Left Behind today, despite the Every Student Succeeds Act. So the last part of this lecture, we're looking at research that I conducted about 4 or 5 years ago. And these are factors affecting public high school performance. And this was looking at public high schools, traditional public high schools in the state of Florida, between the years of 2001 and 2015. And it was looking at what factors are actually affecting public high school performance based on social disorganization theory. And social disorganization theory is a community adversity measure. And it's been used to attribute variations in crime to social ecology factors. So what it says is social ecology elements such as residential mobility, transiency, socioeconomic status, if it's, lower socioeconomic status, high rates of family disruption, high rates of ethnic heterogeneity, and high rates of urbanization, these elements are associated with higher crime and juvenile delinquency. And there's been lots of studies over the past about 60 years that support it. So basically I was saying, let's look at this theory because it kind of combines a lot of things that we would consider to be community adversity or social ecology factors. And it's a theory that has been validated through many other studies. And that's important when you're looking at creating a latent theoretical contextual variable. So social disorganization theory, how does that affect public high school performance? But I also wanted to look at what schools can do about the issue. What do they have control over? And that was available in the state of Florida through an award that's given to schools who meet a fairly long list of family and community engagement activities. They're what's called a Florida five-star school. And once they receive this five-star school award, it means that they've checked the boxes on quite a long list of things. And theoretically, if they are doing this, then this should be leading to better academic performance. So I'm testing that. So community engagement is tested based on if the school completed satisfaction of the five-star school award. And I'm looking at environmental factors and social ecology through social disorganization theory, because you can't test one without the other. And looking at social disorganization theory, it's been already applied to student academic achievement by several researchers, myself one of them. And these are empirical studies, which isn't very surprising. Also, the elements of social disorganization, these indicators as part of that latent theoretical variable, such as socioeconomic status, residential mobility, family disruption issues such as divorce or single parent households, etc. These have been shown through empirical study to be associated with affecting academic performance, either individually and in some cases together as that one social disorganization theory. So putting all of this data together, I have using a US Census based database called the School Attendance Boundary Survey, which measured the community factors, community level factors, these social ecology factors at the school attendance boundary level for that high school. So when we're talking community, it is the community that feeds the high school only, not at the county level or the city, or you could have a mix of different types of neighborhoods and such. This is more specific to that high school. So that was a unique and interesting opportunity to look at it from that context. So we have two hypotheses. One is social disorganization negatively associated with Florida public high school performance at the community level with satisfaction of the Florida 5-star school award criteria effects simultaneously considered. The second hypothesis was satisfaction of the Florida 5-star school award criteria is positively associated with Florida public high school performance at the community level with social disorganization simultaneously considered. So does the 5-star award do those community engagement activities? Are they effective? And behind all of that, how does the environmental context make a difference with education? It's important to note we had 302 high schools in the study, that high schools that were not traditional high schools, for example, if they were magnet schools, had any sort of magnet quality, were excluded from the study because they would bias and skew the results. So these were only your traditional high schools with attendance boundaries. So the conceptual model here, and I used a structural equation model, is you see social disorganization on the left. That's a theoretical construct. And it's combined with several indicators: residential mobility, single parent households, low median income, low education attainment, divorced or separated, and community size. And these are all community level. So does it mean that single parent households equals a bad education outcomes? Absolutely not. It's saying just in aggregate, if there's an area that has high percentage concentrations of this, that has been associated with lower high school performance. Again, same with low median income. It doesn't mean that someone from low median income, I've known many who've done very well academically, it just means an aggregate. In the community, if it's higher percentage in the community, then there's an associated negative effect. Low education attainment, divorced or separated community size. All of these things, as you will notice, and the point of my showing you this study, are outside of the school district, school, teachers' control. None of these things can be changed by the school administration or teachers. Unless Bill Gates lives there and makes them all millionaires, okay, but that's very unrealistic. So that's the point. So these things outside control of the school. What can the school control? The 5-star school award. Now, also there's many other factors, teaching styles, etc., and funding. Funding issues in Florida are relatively equal between schools. It's a per student state level funding system. So could we run the same analysis in California where it's far more varied per student funding? No, you would have to include a variable for funding because there's such discrepancy. Florida, there's not much difference, so we can do that. High school performance is measured in 3 different indicators. And the indicators are FCAT score, that's their standardized test, like the CAT, the California Achievement Test. Non-FCAT score, that's based on graduation rates, number of students taking AP courses, etc. And adequate yearly progress, this is the actual AYP ratio that the schools would get. This is the federal measure, which is kind of a combination between FCAT and non-FCAT in that, but more weighted in improvement. So certain thresholds have to be met and there's have to show improvement. For FCAT score and non-FCAT score, I didn't want to get too far into it because it's very complicated. There's several different measures, but a lot of it isn't just strictly an FCAT score in something, but it's how many students reach a certain threshold, because they're trying to control for some of the variation you're going to see with very high performing schools and low performing. So that's already built into the Florida system that we're testing here, that there should be some accountability for the variance between school districts that's existed for generations. So even with that, as part of the measurement system, we see lots of issues. And forgive my very poorly drawn arrows here. But we see the covariance structure model. So what we've done now is we've run these, and these are just a series of regressions, and we've matched goodness of fit, and every factor we have here is significant. So I'm gonna not bore you with an hour's worth of describing how that was achieved, but here we are. And you will see one factor missing from social disorganization, and that's ethnic heterogeneity. That's basically saying the probability that if you choose 2 students from a group or 2 people from a group, that they will be from different ethnic backgrounds. That was not found to be significant, probably because in Florida you have very homogeneous schools. So you have schools that are they're all one minority or all white or all Hispanic or all Black. Unfortunately, was the case in Florida, so that's probably why it was not significant in this sense. So we see social disorganization. What difference did it make? The hypothesis was supported, and you see it's a very strong relationship. So 1 would be, or in this case, -1, would be for every 1 unit change in social disorganization, you're going to see a negative movement in high school performance. So that means it's very, very highly correlated, a strong correlation. We're at -0.76, which is very strong. So we see a strong, significant negative association with public high school performance at the community level. Again, this is an individual level. This is for the school, the community level. And that's taking into account the Florida 5-Star School Award being measured simultaneously. So that's the things that are not able to be controlled by the school, accounting for most of the negative association. On the other hand, we did have a hypothesis 2 supported. So the schools that did achieve the Florida 5-Star School Award for community engagement, there was a statistically significant positive relationship, meaning they improved performance even while we're still testing at the same time for social disorganization factors. And that means that there's possibility that this is an effective program. There's lots of limitations with this study. I'm not going to go too deep into that. We didn't have data for very, very small counties. We had a data for about 16 million of the 18 million Florida residents. So the majority of the state, but some very small counties couldn't be counted because there wasn't enough information to be statistically significant. Some other issues, 5-Star School Award, you either won it or you didn't. So we didn't have a continuous variable to look at which factors, or we could break it up into multiple factors and measure each one, which factor made a difference. But in general, it did have community engagement, very popular, common methods that had to be achieved. So even though the schools that did that or achieved this level of community engagement showed some positive 0.11. So every 1 increase in 5-Star School Award, you saw 0.11 increase in high school performance unit. It was much smaller. So this goes to show that schools don't have a lot of ability to change high school performance outside of some major structural changes which are outside of the scope of the resources of most school districts. And one could even start to argue, well, in order for schools that are at risk or having trouble to be able to achieve these goals, it would require more resources. But our model right now has gone from extremely inequitable based on the wealth of the community, essentially how much funding your school got, to a little bit more equitable per student funding. That's good. That's more equivalent than equitable. And an equitable model would be, well, what do they need? But we're not there yet. Most states are not. And so certain schools from very high socioeconomic status areas probably don't need as much resources as those from very low socioeconomic status, or in this case, social disorganization as a larger theoretical context. But that would be a tough politically to sell that. And that would probably have a lot of backlash. So I hope that made sense for everyone. And if you have any questions, as always, you could email me. And we're almost done with the semester, so keep it up just a couple more weeks. Take care.